Just a quick background. So before we jump into the invasives topics, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on pollinators, because in order to understand the impacts that these non-native or invasive species can have on pollinators, you need to understand some of their needs and how those invasive species might impact or affect those needs. So just to start out, a lot of folks ask, what is a pollinator generally? And any species that basically moves pollen from one plant to another or transports pollen can be considered a pollinator. So if you brush up against a plant and get pollen on yourself and it happens to be delivered to another plant of the same species, you could be considered a pollinator. But usually when we think of pollinators, we think of bees and bats and birds, butterflies and moths. But really, there's a wide variety of wildlife species that can be considered pollinators. But really, it comes down to the pollen. And that's where I like to kind of differentiate between the intentional versus the incidental pollination. So you walking by and bumping pollen from one flower to another, that would be kind of an incidental pollination event. Whereas bees, especially a lot of our native bees, they intentionally are at these flowers to get not only nectar, but also to use the pollen that they can then use for the reproduction and perpetuation of their species. So it's a very intentional relationship with these flowers, the pollination services that they provide, but also the use of that pollen in their reproductive cycles. So most of my talk is going to be kind of framed around native bees. Pollinators are kind of a catch-all phrase that's used, but for this specific context, I'm going to chat kind of specifically about native bees. It's hard to discuss the impacts on all pollinators just because it's such a broad topic. So just a little bit of background on the biology of some of our native bees, especially in Texas. So we have a mix of social and solitary bees. So honeybees that most folks think of, they're non-native, but they're a social bee. And we do have some social bees in Texas. Most commonly, most folks would think of bumblebees. And then the vast majority of our almost 600 species of native bees in Texas are solitary. So they don't congregate in large nests. They might nest in similar areas, but they kind of individually do their thing. And they're also, most of them are annual species. So just like annual plants, they have an annual life cycle. So the generation that existed in one year will not be the same individuals that are present the following year. In some cases, such as bumblebees, we do have overwintering. So they overwinter as adults and they've already mated. And then in the spring, they'll establish a nest and get that going, but they won't survive into the next year. The next generation will then overwinter. And most of these species are cavity or ground nesters. And this is important, especially when we start talking about the impacts of invasives. So they utilize a lot of open ground habitats of a variety of soil types, but then they also will use a lot of natural cavities or holes that are present in the environment. And they utilize the pollen that's present in the environment or the nectar that's available from the flowering resources, but they also will use other materials. You can think of the leaf cutter bees that will also use flower petals and other things to build their nest, but also to assist in the development of their larvae, which will then turn into the next generation of bees. So when we talk about habitat requirements for pollinators and native bees specifically, it's just like a lot of other wildlife species. There's just a few basic needs. So food, obviously, and that's in the form of nectar and pollen. They need shelter, so they need those nesting and overwintering sites and protection from other competitors. They also need that connectivity. So they need to be able to move around on the landscape, both for foraging, but also for dispersing to new locations and taking advantage of new habitats that might open up due to disturbance or other factors. And then they need freedom from pesticides. So the pesticides have a lot of impacts, and a lot of folks think insecticides, but there's been a lot of recent research that has also tried to look at the impact of some herbicides or, adjuvants or surfactants or other things that are added to herbicides as we try to impact these invasive species and other undesirables. So just to kind of tackle the floral resource topic, native bees and other pollinators, basically, they need abundant pollen and nectar throughout the year. So some of these, they're active during a very short period of time, but a lot of our bees are present on the landscape, actively foraging throughout the year. So we might see, some of those first wildflowers that show up in the spring, which tends to be when we have the largest number and some of the greatest diversity in a lot of our wildflowers in Texas, but they're still going to be out there on the landscape, many of these species foraging through the heat of the summer and even into the fall. And often the fall resources are the ones that are the most limiting. And it's not just for our native bees as they prepare, provision their nests at the end of the season, but also for species that are coming through, and most commonly with monarch butterfly. So they're looking for those groceries to get them down to Mexico, and those fall nectar resources are really important. And they have to be species that are preferred by bees. Some plants, they produce nectar, but they don't really produce an overabundance of pollen, or it's not readily available to pollinators. And then some plants, they produce pollen, but very little nectar. So, the bees and other pollinators will be utilizing these plants for a variety of different reasons. And really, a lot of these native species have adapted with these native plants, unlike invasive species. So they have a unique relationship with them, and they prefer to forage on native, or in some cases, native-like plants. So think flower structure. Some bees and pollinators prefer open face flowers like a sunflower, whereas others like to actually work a little bit harder, and that's their niche to get into, say, lupin or some of those kind of more closed flowers. And then bees are very, very smart. They're very efficient when it comes to finding and utilizing those nectar and pollen resources on the landscape. So if there's a large block of flowers versus, low density a plant here or there, they're going to go to the large block. So they prefer those large areas. And all of these things factor in really tightly to the impact of invasive species. So when we're talking about floral resources, so the food needs of pollinators and invasive plants can have a variety of impacts. And as was mentioned by some of the earlier speakers, these can be positive sometimes, and some of them can be negative. And we kind of need to address both of those. So depending on the invasive species, and all of this is going to be highly dependent on the invasive. You can have an increase or you can have a decrease in overall plant diversity. So in, say, the case of giant reed or kudzu, which are kind of like these, they show up in these really large densities, and in many cases, and they if uncontrolled, they can really have an impact where diversity has gone down because that's about the only thing that's there. So you have these monocultures. But in some cases, where say you have musk thistle, you may have one or two plants on the landscape. So, they're not really having a broad impact on some of the other plants in the community. But in general, what we tend to see is a decline in native plant diversity. So as the native plants are competing for resources, as was mentioned earlier, they don't have the ability in some cases to compete with some of these invasive plant species. So then you see a decline in the diversity and the abundance of some of our native plants. Often, many of our native pollinators, especially our native bees, they have unique relationships developed with these plants. So some of them are specialists. So they only go to one specific type of plant, and that's the only thing they pollinate. We're working on a conservation priority species right now that only gets pollen. The females only get pollen from gum bamelia trees. That's the only plant that they visit for pollen resources to perpetuate themselves into the next generation. And if they lose those plants, the species goes away as well. So that can have a major impact on the pollinators. But in some cases, and musk thistle is another great example, you can see an increase in forage availability for some of the species that tend to be more generalists. So when I've done bumblebee surveys across the West, oftentimes many of the plants that we find the bumblebees on are things like mullein or are invasive non-native thistles. And so sometimes those generalists will actually utilize the extra resources that are out there because it might be more efficient for them to do so. And then another thing that happens when you have an invasive plant, some of the impacts that it can have on the floral resources. So the native pollinators, like I mentioned, they have those tight connections with those native plants. So, and with that, they often are tied to those native plants because of specific nutritional value or specific things in those plants that provide benefits to them. So some of these plants that they visit, they can have, they can really help their health. So they can actually provide almost like an antibiotic effect, or kind of an antiviral, or something that's going to help increase their overall health. And with the loss of some of those native plants to where they get some of those resources to kind of increase their survival, they lose those resources. And in some cases, the nutritional quality of some of the invasive plants, while the bees might visit flowers on an invasive plant, it might not have the nutritional quality. So the pollen from all the different plants that are out there, the nectar that's out there, has a variety of nutritional quality to it. And when you change those, you can see those shifts. And that can have a major impact, because if, say they're providing their young with less nutritious pollen, the survival of their young could be impacted by that. And then one of the things that you also see in some of these species is you see a shift in the availability and the seasonality of the bloom period, or the phenology of the plants. So as an invasive comes in, say there's a monoculture, or they are competing with some of these other plants and they have to push flowers out earlier, or they have to, really make themselves taller and they have less resources to put into blooms. Sometimes that can impact, the floral resources that are available. So it really, you have to think of it kind of more broadly, but like I said, with generalists, that could provide, extra resources that they didn't have previously, because now there's something else on the landscape that they can take advantage of. So the nutritional quality can also be better in some cases where, maybe there was not something they were receiving previously, but now there's some added benefit. So it really depends on the invasive species and what impact it's going to have on a lot of these pollinators. So, a lot of flower visiting species, there could be a non-native that they love to visit and is awesome, and it does great things for them, and they really have some benefits. So you have to kind of do this give and take, and that's why, if folks can't put native plants in their yard, whether it's cost prohibitive, sometimes the native like plants fill some of those niches, or there's certain plants that you can put in that might have some benefit, but you have to be very intentional in understanding how you're utilizing these plants on the landscape, and how these pollinators are interacting with those plants, and what impacts it might have more broadly. There were some questions in the Q&A of, some of these plants, they got brought in for, great intentions, whether it's erosion control or forage, and then down the road, we realized that it has some of these broader impacts. So it's good to kind of think about, the potential that's out there when you're using some of these plants. And then one of the things that a lot of folks don't think about when it comes to pollinators is, how do flowers perpetuate themselves? How do they reproduce? Well, many plants, especially a lot of our flowering plants, the forbs, they need a pollinator to come in and help them produce seed. And one of the disadvantages sometimes when you're trying to manage invasive plants is, you have high seed production. So you have some biocontrols agents that get in there and actually eat the seeds or eat the seed heads and keep them from producing. But when you have pollinators out there on the landscape, they're actually increasing the seed production in a lot of these plants. So you can have some negative impacts as well, of not just the plants on the pollinators, but the pollinators on the habitats and the plant communities on which they depend. But as I've said, it's highly variable depending on the invasive species. So, you can have these large monocultures of, giant reed or kudzu, which have major impacts, where you see entire forest canopies and understories being impacted in some situations. But there's others that, it's very hard to detect what those impacts might actually be, not just on the plant communities and the habitats, but on the pollinators themselves. And the difficulty thing when we think about this as well is, a lot of these invasive plants and their impacts on the pollinators have not been directly studied. One of the most studied pollinators, especially globally, are the honeybees, which are a non-native to North America, but we've kind of studied the impacts. A lot of our invasive species, invasive plants that we have in North America and in Texas come from Eurasia. So they come from Eastern Europe, or they come from Asia. And honeybees are native to those areas. So they see some of these plants, it's like going back to the home country and having these floral resources available to them. So it's not really a big issue for them, because they're a generalist, and some of these they actually evolved to pollinate in their native range. We have started to see that we have growing data for bumblebees. So as there's been more interest in bumblebees and more interest in native pollinators, we've started to see growing evidence for the impact of invasive plants on bumblebees, and also a lot of our other native species. And I think this is really going to increase over the next several years. And now that we've talked a little bit about floral resources, I just wanted to touch on kind of the nesting and overwintering habitat. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the native bees will take advantage of a lot of resources that are on the landscape. Woody debris. If you have a dead tree in your yard and you see all those little beetle holes where the beetles start to take advantage of that dead wood, a lot of native bees will come in and utilize those cavities for nesting habitat. So there's a lot of habitat that's out there, and this can actually be impacted by invasive species as well. So a lot of the Phragmites or giant reed or bamboo, or a lot of species that are not native and sometimes might be considered invasive, sometimes they'll utilize those. And actually, if you go buy one of those solitary bee nesting boxes, most of the debris or the material that's put into those is not native. So you have some native bees that are utilizing something that's been a resource that's been provided by a non-native species. So some of those stems that are left behind by, so especially the hollow-stemmed invasive plants, they'll actually utilize those if they're available. They're very efficient, and they'll utilize things that are out there and made available to them. So some of those things that are invading some of those habitats can be useful and can be utilized. But it's good to think about that, just like the example of tamarisk. So you remove something from the landscape that species have adapted to use or have kind of shifted. So it's such as like the willow flycatcher situation in the Southwest. When you move tamarisk, all the willows are pretty much gone, so they have to take advantage of something. So you have to look at that give and take of, what are the pros and cons of removing an invasive species when you're evaluating what you're going to do and how you're going to strategize the management. So thinking about all those different things that they might utilize, and when you have that nesting habitat, if you have something that's as highly invasive and creates monocultures, you've lost all of your ground nesting habitat, you've lost a lot of other habitats. So you need to think broadly about, the habitat as a whole and how it's being utilized by some of those pollinators. And then connectivity. So this is kind of one of the big questions we get. So the smaller the bee or the smaller the pollinator, the less it's likely to forage, especially these native bees, because like I said, they're very efficient. So if there's not a lot of forage available, close by, they'll go a longer distance, but it makes their ability to reproduce and how many offspring they can reproduce, or sometimes the quality of the pollen that they can obtain, it kind of limits that. So when we're looking at these invasive species, it can impact, the area, the habitats that they can utilize, but also where they can forage and, the habitats that they can move through. Because some of these small bees, they might only go, a couple hundred meters or a few hundred feet from where their nesting habitat is. So if that area has been overtaken by an invasive species and there's no nesting habitat available and no foraging habitat available to them, it can definitely have a large scale impact, especially when you start getting into these specialists. And then the last thing I just kind of wanted to touch on real quick was pesticides. So this covers herbicides and insecticides. When you're trying to protect desirables from invasive plants, it's good to think about how those chemicals operate. So how do they impact plants? So a lot of these plants, you can have an herbicide or a pesticide or an insecticide that is systemic. So it gets absorbed by the plants and made available more broadly throughout the life history of the plant. And some of these herbicides that we use to treat these invasive species also have a soil residual, so they can have an impact on the ability for these native species to come in and colonize those areas after we've removed a non-native, which kind of makes it difficult for some of these insects to have that forage available to them. So it's good to think about those long-term impacts of the native pollinators and their use of some of those spaces after you've removed some of the invasive species. And then as we treat non-desirables, so the surfactants or the adjuvants that we add to those herbicides to make them more effective in controlling the non-desirables or invasive species. There has been some research that has recently shown that, the herbicide itself might not necessarily have an impact on some of these native bees, but the surfactants, or kind of the thing that helps that herbicide stick to the plant and control it more effectively, does have an impact on some of our native bees, in particular bumblebees. So it's good to think about, not just the herbicide or the insecticide, but how some of those other additives can impact things. And then think about non-targets. So most of these herbicides or insecticides can be broad spectrum. Some of them can be very, very good at impacting one specific species of plant, or it's really good at controlling invasive grasses or invasive forbs. But it's good to think about the broad spectrum impacts of those. Sometimes spot spraying might be better than going out and doing broadcast spraying, and trying to think about how you're going to manage those things depending on your situation. And the other thing that I like to point out that we see happen quite often is chemical drift. So if you're using herbicides or insecticides, making sure that you're using things by the label rate and abiding by the law so that you can avoid chemical drift, because that could have large scale impacts. The picture on the far right was an issue where there were trees that were treated for other species, and it actually ended up killing a bunch of bumblebees. Or you can have some broad spectrum, they're trying to treat for one specific type of pest or a plant, and it can have impacts on a lot of other things. So it's good to think about some of those things and how they might impact other entities more broadly. And just real quick, as I finish up, there's a couple lots of resources that are out there and available. NRCS has tons of fantastic resources, the Xerxes Society. And here in Texas, we have a great document you can find on our website, really giving you some advice on how to manage native pollinators on your landscapes. With that, I thank you all for attending.